daytime, and the curious rolling of the eyes, as if she were lapsing in a trance away from her ordinary consciousness, became habitual with her when something threatened and opposed her in life, the conscious life. So they remained as separate in the light and in the thick darkness, married. He supported her daytime authority, kept it inviolable at last, and she, in all the darkness, belonged to him, to his close, insinuating, hypnotic familiarity. All his daytime activity, all his public life was a kind of sleep. She wanted to be free, to belong to the day. And he ran avoiding the day and work. After tea, he went to the shed to his carpentry, or his wood carving. He was restoring the patched, degraded pulpit to its original form. But he loved to have the child near him, playing by his feet. She was a piece of light that really belonged to him, that played within his darkness. He left the shed door on the latch. And when, with his second sense of another presence, he knew she was coming, he was satisfied, he was at rest. When he was alone with her, he did not want to take notice, to talk. He wanted to live unthinking, with her presence flickering upon him. He always went in silence. The child would push open the shed door and see him working by lamplight, his sleeves rolled back. His clothes hung about him, carelessly, like mere wrapping. Inside, his body was concentrated with a flexible, charged power all of its own, isolated. From when she was a tiny child, Ursula could remember his forearm, with its fine black hairs and its electric flexibility, working at the bench through swift, unnoticeable movements, always ambushed in a sort of silence. She hung a moment in the door of the shed, waiting for him to notice her. He turned, his black, curved eyebrows arching slightly. "Hello, Twittermiss." And he closed the door behind her. Then the child was happy in the shed that smelled of sweet wood and resounded to the noise of the plane or the hammer or the saw, yet was charged with the silence of the worker. She played on, intent and absorbed, among the shavings and the little nogs of wood. She never touched him. His feet and legs were near. She did not approach them. She liked to flit out after him when he was going to church at night. If he were going to be alone, he swung her over the wall and let her come. Again she was transported when the door was shut behind them, and they too inherited the big, pale, void place. She would watch him as he lit the organ candles, wait whilst he began practicing his tunes. Then she ran foraging here and there, like a kitten playing by herself in the darkness with eyes dilated. The ropes hung vaguely, twining on the floor, from the bells in the tower, and Ursula always wanted the fluffy, red and white, or blue and white rope grips. But they were above her. Sometimes her mother came to claim her. Then the child was seized with resentment. She passionately resented her mother's superficial authority. She wanted to assert her own detachment. He, however, also gave her occasional cruel shocks. He let her play about in the church. She rifled footstools and hymn books and cushions, like a bee among flowers, whilst the organ echoed away. This continued for some weeks. Then the charwoman worked herself up into a frenzy of rage, to dare to attack Brangwen, and one day descended on him like a harpy. He wilted away and wanted to break the old beast's neck. Instead, he came glowering in fury to the house and turned on Ursula. "Why, you tiresome little monkey, can't you even come to church without pulling the place to bits?" His voice was harsh and cat-like. He was blind to the child. She shrank away in childish anguish and dread. What was it? What awful thing was it? The mother turned with her calm, almost superb manner. "What has she done then?"
Done?
"She shall go in the church no more, pulling and littering and destroying." The wife slowly rolled her eyes and lowered her eyelids. "What has she destroyed then?" He did not know. "I've just had Mrs. Wilkinson at me," he cried, "with a list of things she's done." Ursula withered under the contempt and anger of the she, as he spoke of her. "Send Mrs. Wilkinson here to me with a list of the things she's done," said Anna. "I am the one to hear that." "It's not the things the child has done," continued the mother, "that have put you out so much. It's because you can't bear being spoken to by that old woman. But you haven't the courage to turn on her when she attacks you. You bring your rage here." He relapsed into silence. Ursula knew that he was wrong. In the outside upper world, he was wrong. already came over the child the cold sense of the impersonal world. There she knew her mother was right, but still her heart clamored after her father, for him to be right, in his dark, sensuous underworld. But he was angry and went his way in blackness and brutal silence again. The child ran about absorbed in life, quiet, full of amusement. She did not notice things, nor changes, nor alterations. One day she would find daisies in the grass. Another day, apple blossoms would be sprinkled white on the ground, and she would run among it, for pleasure because it was there. Yet again birds would be pecking at the cherries. Her father would throw cherries down from the tree all round her on the garden. Then the fields were full of hay. She did not remember what had been nor what would be. The outside things were there each day. She was always herself. The world outside was accidental. Even her mother was accidental to her, a condition that happened to endure. Only her father occupied any permanent position in the childish consciousness. When he came back, she remembered vaguely how he had gone away. When he went away, she knew vaguely that she must wait for his coming back. Whereas her mother, returning from an outing, merely became present. There was no reason for connecting her with some previous departure. The return or the departure of the father was the one event which the child remembered. When he came, something woke up in her, some yearning. She knew when he was out of joint or irritable or tired. Then she was uneasy. She could not rest. When he was in the house, the child felt full and warm, rich like a creature in the sunshine. When he was gone, she was vague, forgetful. When he scolded her even, she was often more aware of him than of herself. He was her strength and her greater self. Ursula was 3 years old when another baby girl was born. Then the two small sisters were much together, Gudrun and Ursula. Gudrun was a quiet child who played for hours alone, absorbed in her fancies. She was brown-haired, fair-skinned, strangely placid, almost passive. Yet her will was indomitable, once set. From the first, she followed Ursula's lead. Yet she was a thing to herself, so that to watch the two together was strange. They were like two young animals playing together, but not taking real notice of each other. Gudrun was the mother's favorite, except that Anna always lived in her latest baby. The burden of so many lives depending on him wore the youth down. He had his work in the office, which was done purely by effort of will. He had his barren passion for the church. He had 3 young children. Also, at this time, his health was not good. So, he was haggard and irritable, often a pest in the house. Then he was told to go to his woodwork or to the church. Between him and the little Ursula, there came into being a strange alliance. They were aware of each other. He knew the child was always on his side, but in his consciousness, he counted it for nothing. She was always for him. He took it for granted. Yet his life was based on her, even whilst she was a tiny child, on her support and her accord. Anna continued in her violent trance of motherhood, always busy, often harassed, but always contained in her trance of motherhood. She seemed to exist in her own violent fruitfulness, and it was as if the sun shone tropically on her. Her color was bright, her eyes full of a fecund gloom, her brown hair tumbled loosely over her ears. She had a look of richness. No responsibility, no sense of duty troubled her. The outside, public life was less than nothing to her, really. Whereas when, at 26, he found himself father of 4 children, with a wife who lived intrinsically like the ruddiest lilies of the field, he let the weight of responsibility press on him and drag him. It was then that his child Ursula strove to be with him. She was with him, even as a baby of 4, when he was irritable and shouted and made the household unhappy. She suffered from his shouting, but somehow it was not really him. She wanted it to be over. She wanted to resume her normal connection with him. When he was disagreeable, the child echoed to the crying of some need in him, and she responded blindly. Her heart followed him as if he had some tie with her, and some love which he could not deliver. Her heart followed him persistently, in its love. But there was the dim, childish sense of her own smallness and inadequacy, a fatal sense of worthlessness. She could not do anything. She was not enough. She could not be important to him. This knowledge deadened her from the first. Still, she set towards him like a quivering needle. All her life was directed by her awareness of him, her wakefulness to his being. And she was against her mother. Her father was the dawn wherein her consciousness woke up. But for him, she might have gone on like the other children, Gudrun and Teresa and Catherine, one with the flowers and insects and playthings, having no existence apart from the concrete object of her attention. But her father came too near to her. The clasp of his hands and the power of his breast woke her up almost in pain from the transient unconsciousness of childhood. Wide-eyed, unseeing, she was awake before she knew how to see. She was wakened too soon. Too soon the call had come to her, when she was a small baby and her father held her close to his breast. Her sleep-living heart was beaten into wakefulness by the striving of his bigger heart, by his clasping her to his body for love and for fulfillment, asking as a magnet must always ask. From her the response had struggled dimly, vaguely into being. The children were dressed roughly for the country. When she was little, Ursula pattered about in little wooden clogs, a blue overall over her thick red dress, a red shawl crossed on her breast and tied behind again. So she ran with her father to the garden. The household rose early. He was out digging by 6 o'clock in the morning. He went to his work at 8:30, and Ursula was usually in the garden with him, though not near at hand. At Easter time one year, she helped him to set potatoes. It was the first time she had ever helped him. The occasion remained as a picture, one of her earliest memories. They had gone out soon after dawn. A cold wind was blowing. He had his old trousers tucked into his boots. He wore no coat nor waistcoat. His shirt sleeves fluttered in the wind. His face was ruddy and intent, in a kind of sleep. When he was at work, he neither heard nor saw. A long, thin man, looking still a youth, with a line of black mustache above his thick mouth and his fine hair blown on his forehead, he worked away at the earth in the gray first light, alone. His solitariness drew the child like a spell. The wind came chill over the dark green fields. Ursula ran up and watched him push the setting peg in at one side of his ruddy earth, stride across, and push it in the other side, pulling the line taut and clear upon the clods intervening. Then, with a sharp cutting noise, the bright spade came towards her, cutting a grip into the new, soft earth. He struck his spade upright and straightened himself. "Do you want to help me?" he said. She looked up at him from out of her little woolen bonnet. "Aye," he said. "You can put some taters in for me. Look like that, these little sprits standing up so much apart, you see." And stooping down, he quickly, surely placed the spreet potatoes in the soft grip, where they rested separate and pathetic on the heavy, cold earth. He gave her a little basket of potatoes and strode himself to the other end of the line. She saw him stooping, working towards her. She was excited and amused. She put in one potato, then rearranged it to make it sit nicely. Some of the sprits were broken, and she was afraid. The responsibility excited her like a string tying her up. She could not help looking with dread at the string buried under the heaped-back soil. Her father was working nearer, stooping, working nearer. She was overcome by her responsibility. She put potatoes quickly into the cold earth. He came near. "Not so close," he said, stooping over her potatoes, taking some out and rearranging the others. She stood by with the painful, terrified helplessness of childhood. He was so unseeing and confident. She wanted to do the thing, and yet she could not. She stood by looking on, her little blue overall fluttering in the wind, the red woolen ends of her shawl blowing gustily. Then he went down the row, relentlessly, turning the potatoes in with his sharp spade cuts. He took no notice of her, only worked on. He had another world from hers. She stood helplessly stranded on his world. He continued his work. She knew she could not help him. A little bit forlorn. At last she turned away and ran down the garden, away from him, as fast as she could go away from him, to forget him and his work. He missed her presence, her face in her red woolen bonnet, her blue overall fluttering. She ran to where a little water ran trickling between grass and stones, that she loved. When he came by, he said to her, "You didn't help me much." The child looked at him dumbly. Already her heart was heavy because of her own disappointment. Her mouth was dumb and pathetic, but he did not notice. He went his way. And she played on because of her disappointment persisting even the more in her play. She dreaded work because she could not do it as he did it. She was conscious of the great breach between them. She knew she had no power. The grown-up power to work deliberately was a mystery to her. He would smash into her sensitive child's world destructively. Her mother was lenient, careless. The children played about, as they would all day. Ursula was thoughtless. Why should she remember things? If across the garden she saw the hedge had budded, and if she wanted these green-a-pink, tiny buds for bread and cheese to play at tea party with, over she went for them. Then suddenly, perhaps the next day, her soul would almost start out of her body as her father turned on her, shouting, "Who's been trampling and dancing across where I've just sowed seed? I know it's you, nuisance. Can you find nowhere else to walk, but just over my seed beds? But it's like you, that is, no heed but to follow your own greedy nose." It had shocked him in his intent world to see the zigzagging lines of deep little footprints across his work. The child was infinitely more shocked. Her vulnerable little soul was flayed and trampled. Why were the footprints there? She had not wanted to make them. She stood dazzled with pain and shame and unreality. Her soul, her consciousness seemed to die away. She became shut off and senseless, a little fixed creature whose soul had gone hard and unresponsive. The sense of her own unreality hardened her like a frost. She cared no longer, and the sight of her face, shut and superior with self-asserting indifference, made a flame of rage go over him. He wanted to break her. "I'll break your obstinate little face," he said, through shut teeth, lifting his hand. The child did not alter in the least. The look of indifference, complete glancing indifference, as if nothing but herself existed to her, remained fixed. Yet far away in her, the sobs were tearing her soul. And when he had gone, she would go and creep under the parlor sofa and lie clinched in the silent, hidden misery of childhood. When she crawled out, after an hour or so, she went rather stiffly to play. She willed to forget. She cut off her childish soul from memory, so that the pain and the insult should not be real. She asserted herself only. There was not nothing in the world but her own self. So, very soon, she came to believe in the outward malevolence that was against her. And very early, she learned that even her adored father was part of this malevolence. And very early, she learned to harden her soul in resistance and denial of all that was outside her, harden herself upon her own being. She never felt sorry for what she had done. She never forgave those who had made her guilty. If he had said to her, "Why, Ursula, did you trample my carefully made bed?" that would have hurt her to the quick, and she would have done anything for him. But she was always tormented by the unreality of outside things. The earth was to walk on. Why must she avoid a certain patch, just because it was called a seedbed? It was the earth to walk on. This was her instinctive assumption. And when he bullied her, she became hard, cut herself off from all connection, lived in the little separate world of her own violent will. As she grew older, 5, 6, 7, the connection between her and her father was even stronger, yet it was always straining to break. She was always relapsing on her own violent will into her own separate world of herself. This made him grind his teeth with bitterness, for he still wanted her. But she could harden herself into her own self's universe, impregnable. He was very fond of swimming, and in warm weather would take her down to the canal, to a silent place, or to a big pond or a reservoir, to bathe. He would take her on his back as he went swimming, and she clung close, feeling his strong movement under her, so strong, as if it would uphold all the world. Then he taught her to swim. She was a fearless little thing when he dared her, and he had a curious craving to frighten her, to see what she would do with him. He said, would she ride on his back whilst he jumped off the canal bridge down into the water beneath? She would. He loved to feel the naked child clinging on to his shoulders. There was a curious fight between their two wills. He mounted the parapet of the canal bridge. The water was a long way down, but the child had a deliberate will set upon his. She held herself fixed to him. He leapt, and down they went. The crash of the water as they went under struck through the child's small body with a sort of unconsciousness. But she remained fixed. And when they came up again, and when they went to the bank, and when they sat on the grass side by side, he laughed and said it was fine. And the dark dilated eyes of the child looked at him wonderingly, darkly, wondering from the shock, yet reserved and unfathomable. So he laughed almost with a sob. In a moment she was clinging safely on his back again, and he was swimming in deep water. She was used to his nakedness and to her mother's nakedness. Ever since she was born, they were clinging to each other and making up to each other for the strange blow that had been struck at them. Yet still, on other days, he would leap again with her from the bridge, daringly, almost wickedly, till at length, as he leapt once, she dropped forward onto his head and nearly broke his neck, so that they fell into the water in a heap and fought for few moments with death. He saved her and sat on the bank, quivering, but his eyes were full of the blackness of death. It was as if death had cut between their two lives and separated them. Still, they were not separate. There was this curious, taunting intimacy between them. When the fair came, she wanted to go in the swing boats. He took her, and, standing up in the boat, holding on to the irons, began to drive higher, perilously higher. The child clung fast on her seat. "Do you want to go any higher?" he said to her, and she laughed with her mouth, her eyes wide and dilated. They were rushing through the air. "Yes," she said, feeling as if she would turn into vapor, lose hold of everything, and melt away. The boat swung far up, then down like a stone, only to be caught sickeningly up again. "Any higher?" he called, looking at her over his shoulder, his face evil and beautiful to her. She laughed with white lips. He sent the swing boat sweeping through the air in a great semicircle, till it jerked and swayed at the high horizontal. The child clung on, pale, her eyes fixed on him. People below were calling. The jerk at the top had almost shaken them both out. He had done what he could, and he was attracting censure. He sat down and let the swing boat swing itself out. People in the crowd cried shame on him as he came out of the swing boat. He laughed. The child clung to his hand, pale and mute. In a while she was violently sick. He gave her lemonade and she gulped a little. "Don't tell your mother you've been sick," he said. There was no need to ask that. When she got home, the child crept away under the parlor sofa like a sick little animal and was a long time before she crawled out. But Anna got to know of this escapade and was passionately angry and contemptuous of him. His golden brown eyes glittered. He had a strange, cruel little smile. And as the child watched him, for the first time in her life a disillusion came over her, something cold and isolating. She went over to her mother. Her soul was dead towards him. It made her sick. Still she forgot and continued to love him, but ever more coldly. He was at this time, when he was about 28 years old, strange and violent in his being, sensual. He acquired some power over Anna, over everybody he came into contact with. After a long bout of hostility, Anna at last closed with him. She had now 4 children, all girls. For 7 years she had been absorbed in wifehood and motherhood. For years he had gone on beside her, never really encroaching upon her. Then gradually another self seemed to assert its being within him. He was still silent and separate, but she could feel him all the while coming near upon her, as if his breast and his body were threatening her, and he was always coming closer. Gradually, he became indifferent of responsibility. He would do what pleased him, and no more. He began to go away from home. He went to Nottingham on Saturdays, always alone, to the football match and to the music hall, and all the time he was watching in readiness. He never cared to drink, but with his hard, golden brown eyes, so keen-seeing with their tiny black pupils, he watched all the people, everything that happened, and he waited. In the Empire one evening, he sat next to 2 girls. He was aware of the one beside him. She was rather small, common, with a fresh complexion and an upper lip that lifted from her teeth, so that, when she was not conscious, her mouth was slightly open and her lips pressed outwards in a kind of blind appeal. She was strongly aware of the man next to her, so that all her body was still very still. Her face watched the stage. Her arms went down into her lap, very self-conscious and still. A gleam lit up in him. Should he begin with her? Should he begin with her to live the other, the unadmitted life of his desire? Why not? He had always been so good. Save for his wife, he was a virgin. And why, when all women were different? Why, when he would only live once? He wanted the other life. His own life was barren, not enough. He wanted the other. Her open mouth, showing the small, irregular, white teeth, appealed to him. It was open and ready. It was so vulnerable. Why should he not go in and enjoy what was there? The slim arm that went down so still and motionless to the lap. It was pretty. She would be small. He would be able almost to hold her in his two hands. She would be small, almost like a child, and pretty. Her childishness whetted him keenly. She would he helpless between his hands. That was the best turn we've had, he said to her, leaning over as he clapped his hands. He felt strong and unshakable in himself, set over against all the world. His soul was keen and watchful, glittering with a kind of amusement. He was perfectly self-contained. He was himself the absolute. The rest of the world was the object that should contribute to his being. The girl started, turned round. Her eyes lit up with an almost painful flash of a smile. The color came deeply in her cheeks. Yes, it was, she said, quite meaninglessly, and she covered her rather prominent teeth with her lips. Then she sat looking straight before her, seeing nothing, only conscious of the color burning in her cheeks. It pricked him with a pleasant sensation. His veins and his nerves attended to her. She was so young and palpitating. It's not such a good program as last week's, he said. Again she half turned her face to him, and her clear, bright eyes, bright like shallow water, filled with light, frightened, yet involuntarily lighting and shaking with response. Oh, isn't it? I wasn't able to come last week. He noted the common accent. It pleased him. He knew what class she came of. Probably she was a warehouse lass. He was glad she was a common girl. He proceeded to tell her about the last week's program. She answered at random, very confusedly. The color burned in her cheek, yet she always answered him. The girl on the other side sat remotely, obviously silent. He ignored her. All his address was for his own girl, with her bright, shallow eyes and her vulnerably opened mouth. The talk went on, meaningless and random on her part, quite deliberate and purposive on his. It was a pleasure to him to make this conversation, an activity pleasant as a fine game of chance and skill. He was very quiet and pleasant-humored, but so full of strength. She fluttered beside his steady pressure of warmth and his surety. He saw the performance drawing to a close. His senses were alert and willful. He would press his advantages. He followed her and her plain friend down the stairs to the street. It was raining. It's a nasty night, he said. Shall you come and have a drink of something? A cup of coffee? It's early yet. Oh, I don't think so, she said, looking away into the night. I wish you would, he said, putting himself as it were at her mercy. There was a moment's pause. Come to Rollins, he said. No, not there. To Carson's, then? There was a silence. The other girl hung on. The man was the center of positive force. Will your friend come as well? There was another moment of silence, while the other girl felt her ground. No, thanks, she said. I've promised to meet a friend. Another time then, he said. Oh, thanks, she replied, very awkward. Good night, he said. See you later, said his girl to her friend. Where? Said the friend. You know Gertie, replied his girl. All right, Jenny. The friend was gone into the darkness. He turned with his girl to the tea shop. They talked all the time. He made his sentences in sheer, almost muscular pleasure of exercising himself with her. He was looking at her all the time, perceiving her, appreciating her, finding her out, gratifying himself with her. He could see distinct attractions in her. Her eyebrows, with their particular curve, gave him keen aesthetic pleasure. Later on, he would see her bright, pellucid eyes, like shallow water, and know those. And there remained the open, exposed mouth, red and vulnerable, that he reserved as yet, and all the while his eyes were on the girl, estimating and handling with pleasure her young softness. About the girl herself, who or what she was, he cared nothing. He was quite unaware that she was anybody. She was just the sensual object of his attention. "Shall we go then?" he said. She rose in silence, as if acting without a mind, merely physically. He seemed to hold her in his will. Outside it was still raining. "Let's have a walk," he said. "I don't mind the rain, do you?" "No, I don't mind it," she said. He was alert in every sense and fiber, and yet quite sure and steady, and lit up, as if transfused. He had a free sensation of walking in his own darkness, not in anybody else's world at all. He was purely a world to himself. He had nothing to do with any general consciousness. Just his own senses were supreme. All the rest was external, insignificant, leaving him alone with this girl whom he wanted to absorb, whose properties he wanted to absorb into his own senses. He did not care about her, except that he wanted to overcome her resistance, to have her in his power, fully and exhaustively to enjoy her. They turned into the dark streets. He held her umbrella over her and put his arm round her. She walked as if she were unaware, but gradually as he walked, he drew her a little closer into the movement of his side and hip. She fitted in there very well. It was a real good fit to walk with her like this. It made him exquisitely aware of his own muscular self, and his hand that grasped her side felt one curve of her, and it seemed like a new creation to him, a reality, an absolute, an existing tangible beauty of the absolute. It was like a star. Everything in him was absorbed in the sensual delight of this one small, firm curve in her body that his hand and his whole being had lighted upon. He led her into the park, where it was almost dark. He noticed a corner between two walls, under a great overhanging bush of ivy. "Let us stand here a minute," he said. He put down the umbrella and followed her into the corner, retreating out of the rain. He needed no eyes to see. All he wanted was to know through touch. She was like a piece of palpable darkness. He found her in the darkness, put his arms round her and his hands upon her. She was silent and inscrutable, but he did not want to know anything about her. He only wanted to discover her. And through her clothing, what absolute beauty he touched. "Take your hat off," he said. Silently, obediently, she shook off her hat and gave herself to his arms again. He liked her. He liked the feel of her. He wanted to know her more closely. He let his fingers subtly seek out her cheek and neck. What amazing beauty and pleasure in the dark. His fingers had often touched Anna on the face and neck like that. What matter? It was one man who touched Anna, another who now touched this girl. He liked best his new self. He was given over altogether to the sensuous knowledge of this woman, and every moment he seemed to be touching absolute beauty, something beyond knowledge. Very close, marveling and exceedingly joyful in their discoveries, his hands pressed upon her, so subtly, so seekingly, so finely and desirously searching her out, that she too was almost swooning in the absolute of sensual knowledge. In utter sensual delight, she clenched her knees, her thighs, her loins together. It was an added beauty to him. But he was patiently working for her relaxation, patiently, his whole being fixed in the smile of latent gratification, his whole body electric with a subtle, powerful, reducing force upon her. So he came at length to kiss her, and she was almost betrayed by his insidious kiss. Her open mouth was too helpless and unguarded. He knew this, and his first kiss was very gentle and soft and assuring, so that her soft, defenseless mouth became assured, even bold, seeking upon his mouth. And he answered her gradually, his soft kiss sinking in softly, but ever more heavily yet, till it was too heavy for her to meet, and she began to sink under it. She was sinking. His smile of latent gratification was becoming more tense. He was sure of her. He let the whole force of his will sink upon her to sweep her away. But it was too great a shock for her. With a sudden, horrible movement, she ruptured the state that contained them both. Don't. It was a rather horrible cry that seemed to come out of her, not to belong to her. It was some strange agony of terror, crying out the words, There was something vibrating and beside herself in the noise. His nerves ripped like silk. "What's the matter?" he said, as if calmly. "What's the matter?" She came back to him, but trembling, reservedly this time. Her cry had given him gratification, but he knew he had been too sudden for her. He was now careful. For a while he merely sheltered her. Also, there had broken a flaw into his perfect will. He wanted to persist, to begin again, to lead up to the point where he had let himself go on her, and then manage more carefully, successfully. So far she had won, and the battle was not over yet. But another voice woke in him and prompted him to let her go in contempt. He sheltered her and soothed her and caressed her and kissed her, and again began to come nearer, nearer. He gathered himself together. Even if he did not take her, he would make her relax. He would fuse away her resistance. So softly, softly, with infinite caressiveness he kissed her, and the whole of his being seemed to fondle her. Till, at the verge, swooning at the breaking point, there came from her a beaten, inarticulate, moaning cry. "Don't, oh, don't." His veins fused with extreme voluptuousness. For a moment, he almost lost control of himself and continued automatically. But there was a moment of inaction, of cold suspension. He was not going to take her. He drew her to him and soothed her and caressed her, but the pure zest had gone. She struggled to herself and realized he was not going to take her. And then, at the very last moment, when his fondling had come near again, his hot living desire despising her, against his cold, sensual desire, she broke violently away from him. "Don't," she cried, harsh now with hatred, and she flung her hand across and hit him violently. "Keep off of me." His blood stood still for a moment. Then the smile came again within him, steady, cruel. "Why? What's the matter?" he said, with suave irony. "Nobody's going to hurt you." "I know what you want," she said. "I know what I want," he said. "What's the odds?" "Well, you're not going to have it off me." "Aren't I? Well, then I'm not. It's no use crying about it, is it?" "No, it isn't," said the girl, rather disconcerted by his irony. "But there's no need to have a row about it. We can kiss goodnight just the same, can't we?" She was silent in the darkness. "Or, do you want your hat and umbrella to go home this minute?" Still she was silent. He watched her dark figure as she stood there on the edge of the faint darkness, and he waited. "Come and say goodnight nicely if we're going to say it," he said. Still she did not stir. He put his hand out and drew her into the darkness again. "It's warmer in here," he said, "a lot cozier." His will had not yet relaxed from her. The moment of hatred exhilarated him. "I'm going now," she muttered as he closed his hand over her. "See how well you fit your place," he said as he drew her to her previous position, close upon him. "What do you want to leave it for?" And gradually the intoxication invaded him again. The zest came back. After all, why should he not take her? But she did not yield to him entirely. "Are you a married man?" she asked at length. "What if I am?" he said. She did not answer. "I don't ask you whether you're married or not," he said. "You know jolly well I'm not," she answered hotly. Oh, if she could only break away from him, if only she need not yield to him. At length her will became cold against him. She had escaped, but she hated him for her escape more than for her danger. Did he despise her so coldly? And she was in torture of adherence to him still. "Shall I see you next week? Next Saturday?" he said as they returned to the town. She did not answer. "Come to the Empire with me. You and Gertie," he said. "I should look well, going with a married man," she said. "I'm no less of a man for being married, am I?" he said. "Oh, it's a different matter altogether with a married man," she said, in a ready-made speech that showed her chagrin. "How's that?" he asked. But she would not enlighten him, yet she promised, without promising, to be at the meeting place next Saturday evening. So he left her. He did not know her name. He caught a train and went home. It was the last train. He was very late. He was not home till midnight. But he was quite indifferent. He had no real relation with his home, not this man which he now was. Anna was sitting up for him. She saw the queer, absolved look on his face, a sort of latent, almost sinister smile, as if he were absolved from his good ties. "Where have you been?" she asked, puzzled, interested. "To the Empire." "Who with?" "By myself. I came home with Tom Cooper." She looked at him and wondered what he had been doing. She was indifferent as to whether he lied or not. "You have come home very strange," she said, and there was an appreciative inflection in the speech. He was not affected. As for his humble, good self, he was absolved from it. He sat down and ate heartily. He was not tired. He seemed to take no notice of her. For Anna, the moment was critical. She kept herself aloof and watched him. He talked to her, but with a little indifference, since he was scarcely aware of her. So, then she did not affect him. Here was a new turn of affairs. He was rather attractive, nevertheless. She liked him better than the ordinary mute, half-effaced, half-subdued man she usually knew him to be. So, he was blossoming out into his real self. It piqued her. Very good. Let him blossom. She liked a new turn of affairs. He was a strange man come home to her. Glancing at him, she saw she could not reduce him to what he had been before. In an instant she gave it up, yet not without a pang of rage, which would insist on their old, beloved love, their old, accustomed intimacy and her old, established supremacy. She almost rose up to fight for them, and looking at him and remembering his father, she was wary. This was the new turn of affairs. Very good. If she could not influence him in the old way, she would be level with him in the new. Her old defiant hostility came up. Very good. She too was out on her own adventure. Her voice, her manner changed. She was ready for the game. Something was liberated in her. She liked him. She liked this strange man come home to her. He was very welcome, indeed. She was very glad to welcome a stranger. She had been bored by the old husband. To his latent, cruel smile, she replied with brilliant challenge. He expected her to keep the moral fortress. Not she. It was much too dull a part. She challenged him back with a sort of radiance, very bright and free, opposite to him. He looked at her, and his eyes glinted. She too was out in the field. His senses pricked up and keenly attended to her. She laughed, perfectly indifferent and loose as he was. He came toward her. She neither rejected him nor responded to him. In a kind of radiance, superb in her inscrutability, she laughed before him. She too could throw everything overboard: love, intimacy, responsibility. What were her 4 children to her now? What did it matter that this man was the father of her 4 children? He was the sensual male seeking his pleasure. She was the female ready to take hers. But in her own way, a man could turn into a freelance, so then could a woman. She adhered as little as he to the moral world. All that had gone before was nothing to her. She was another woman, under the instance of a strange man. He was a stranger to her, seeking his own ends. Very good. She wanted to see what this stranger would do now, what he was. She laughed and kept him at arm's length, whilst apparently ignoring him. She watched him undress, as if he were a stranger. Indeed, he was a stranger to her, and she roused him profoundly, violently, even before he touched her. The little creature in Nottingham had but been leading up to this. They abandoned in one motion the moral position. Each was seeking gratification pure and simple. Strange as wife was to him. It was as if he were a perfect stranger, as if she were infinitely and essentially strange to him, the other half of the world, the dark half of the moon. She waited for his touch, as if he were a marauder who had come in, infinitely unknown and desirable to her. And he began to discover her. He had an inkling of the vastness of the unknown sensual store of delights she was, with a passion of voluptuousness that made him dwell on each tiny beauty in a kind of frenzy of enjoyment. He lit upon her beauty, the beauties, the several beauties of her body. He was quite ousted from himself and sensually transported by that which he discovered in her. He was another man reveling over her. There was no tenderness, no love between them any more, only the maddening, sensuous lust for discovery and the insatiable, exorbitant gratification in the sensual beauties of her body. And she was a store of absolute beauties that it drove him to contemplate. There was such a feast to enjoy, and he with only one man's capacity. He lived in a passion of sensual discovery with her for some time. It was a duel. No love, no words, no kisses even. Only the maddening perception of beauty consummate, absolute through touch. He wanted to touch her, to discover her. Maddeningly, he wanted to know her. Yet he must not hurry, or he missed everything. He must enjoy one beauty at a time. And the multitudinous beauties of her body, the many little rapturous places, sent him mad with delight, and with desire to be able to know more, to have strength to know more. For all was there. He would say during the daytime, "Tonight I shall know the little hollow under her ankle, where the blue vein crosses." And the thought of it, and the desire for it, made a thick darkness of anticipation. He would go all the day waiting for the night to come, when he could give himself to the enjoyment of some luxurious absolute of beauty in her. The thought of the hidden resources of her, the undiscovered beauties and ecstatic places of delight in her body, waiting, only waiting for him to discover them, sent him slightly insane. He was obsessed. If he did not discover and make known to himself these delights, they might be lost forever. He wished he had 100 men's energies with which to enjoy her. He wished he were a cat, to lick her with a rough, grating, lascivious tongue. He wanted to wallow in her, bury himself in her flesh, cover himself over with her flesh. And she, separate, with a strange, dangerous, glistening look in her eyes, received all his activities upon her as if they were expected by her, and provoked him when he was quiet to more, till sometimes he was ready to perish for sheer inability to be satisfied of her, inability to have had enough of her. Their children became mere offspring to them. They lived in the darkness and death of their own sensual activities. Sometimes he felt he was going mad with a sense of absolute beauty, perceived by him in her through his senses. It was something too much for him. And in everything was this same, almost sinister, terrifying beauty. But in the revelations of her body through contact with his body was the ultimate beauty, to know which was almost death in itself, and yet for the knowledge of which he would have undergone endless torture. He would have forfeited anything, rather than forego his right even to the instep of her foot, and the place from which the toes radiated out, the little, miraculous white plain from which ran the little hillocks of the toes, and the folded, dimpling hollows between the toes. He felt he would have died rather than forfeit this. This was what their love had become, a sensuality violent and extreme as death. They had no conscious intimacy, no tenderness of love. It was all the lust and the infinite, maddening intoxication of the sense, a passion of death. He had always, all his life, had a secret dread of absolute beauty. It had always been like a fetish to him, something to fear, really, for it was immoral and against mankind. So he had turned to the Gothic form, which always asserted the broken desire of mankind in its pointed arches, escaping the rolling, absolute beauty of the round arch. But now he had given way, and with infinite sensual violence gave himself to the realization of this supreme, immoral, absolute beauty in the body of woman. It seemed to him that it came to being in the body of woman, under his touch, even under his sight. It was there. But when he neither saw nor touched the perfect place, it was not perfect, it was not there. And he must make it exist. But still the thing terrified him. Awful and threatening it was, dangerous to a degree, even whilst he gave himself to it. It was pure darkness, also. All the shameful things of the body revealed themselves to him now with a sort of sinister, tropical beauty. All the shameful, natural and unnatural acts of sensual voluptuousness which he and the woman partook of together, created together, they had their heavy beauty and their delight. Shame, what was it? It was part of extreme delight. It was that part of delight of which man is usually afraid. Why afraid? The secret, shameful things are most terribly beautiful. They accepted shame and were one with it in their most unlicensed pleasures. It was incorporated. It was a bud that blossomed into beauty and heavy, fundamental gratification. Their outward life went on much the same, but the inward life was revolutionized. The children became less important, the parents were absorbed in their own living. And gradually, Brangwen began to find himself free to attend to the outside life as well. His intimate life was so violently active that it set another man in him free. And this new man turned with interest to public life to see what part he could take in it. This would give him scope for new activity of a kind for which he was now created and released. He wanted to be unanimous with the whole of purpose of mankind. At this time, education was in the forefront as a subject of interest. There was the talk of new Swedish methods of handwork instruction and so on. Brangwen embraced sincerely the idea of handwork in schools. For the first time, he began to take real interest in a public affair. He had at length, from his profound sensual activity, developed a real purposive self. There was talk of night schools and of handicraft classes. He wanted to start a woodwork class in Kossethe to teach carpentry and joinery and wood carving to the village boys, 2 nights a week. This seemed to him a supremely desirable thing to be doing. His pay would be very little, and when he had it, he spent it all on extra wood and tools. But he was very happy and keen in his new public spirit. He started his night classes in woodwork when he was 30 years old. By this time, he had 5 children, the last a boy. But boy or girl mattered very little to him. He had a natural blood affection for his children, and he liked them as they turned up, boys or girls. Only he was fondest of Ursula. Somehow, she seemed to be at the back of his new night school venture. The house by the yew trees was in connection with the great human endeavor at last. It gained a new vigor thereby. To Ursula, a child of 8, the increase in magic was considerable. She heard all the talk. She saw the parish room fitted up as a workshop. The parish room was a high, stone, barn-like, ecclesiastical building standing away by itself in the Brangwen's second garden, across the lane. She was always attracted by its age and its stranded obsoleteness. Now she watched preparations made. She sat on the flight of stone steps that came down from the porch to the garden and heard her father and the vicar talking and planning and working. Then an inspector came, a very strange man, and stayed talking with her father all one evening. Everything was settled, and 12 boys enrolled their names. It was very exciting. But to Ursula, everything her father did was magic. Whether he came from Ilkeston with news of the town, whether he went across to the church with his music or his tools on a sunny evening, whether he sat in his white surplice at the organ on Sundays, leading the singing with his strong tenor voice, or whether he were in the workshop with the boys, he was always a center of magic and fascination to her, his voice, sounding out in command, cheerful, laconic, had always a twang in it that sent a thrill over her blood and hypnotized her. She seemed to run in the shadow of some dark, potent secret of which she would not, of whose existence even she dared not become conscious. It cast such a spell over her and so darkened her mind. 9. The marsh and the flood. There was always regular connection between the yew cottage and the marsh, yet the 2 households remained separate, distinct. After Anna's marriage, the marsh became the home of the 2 boys, Tom and Fred. Tom was a rather short, good-looking youth, with crisp black hair and long black eyelashes and soft, dark, possessed eyes. He had a quick intelligence. From the high school, he went to London to study. He had an instinct for attracting people of character and energy. He gave place entirely to the other person, and at the same time kept himself independent. He scarcely existed except through other people. When he was alone, he was unresolved. When he was with another man, he seemed to add himself to the other, make the other bigger than life size, so that a few people loved him and attained a sort of fulfillment in him. He carefully chose these few. He had a subtle, quick, critical intelligence, a mind that was like a scale or balance. There was something of a woman in all this. In London, he had been the favorite pupil of an engineer, a clever man, who became well known at the time when Tom Brangwen had just finished his studies. Through this master, the youth kept acquaintance with various individual, outstanding characters. He never asserted himself. He seemed to be there to estimate and establish the rest. He was like a presence that makes us aware of our own being. So that he was, while still young, connected with some of the most energetic scientific and mathematical people in London. They took him as an equal, Quiet and perceptive and impersonal as he was, he kept his place and learned how to value others in just degree. He was there like a judgment. Besides, he was very good-looking, of medium stature, but beautifully proportioned, dark, with fine coloring, always perfectly healthy. His father allowed him a liberal pocket money, besides which he had a sort of post as assistant to his chief. Then from time to time the young man appeared at the marsh, curiously attractive, well-dressed, reserved, having by nature a subtle, refined manner, and he set the change in the farm. Fred, the younger brother, was a Brangwen, large-boned, blue-eyed, English. He was his father's very son. The two men, father and son, were supremely at ease with one another. Fred was succeeding to the farm. Between the elder brother and the younger existed an almost passionate love. Tom watched over Fred with a woman's poignant attention and selfless care. Fred looked up to Tom as to something miraculous, that which he himself would aspire to be, were he great also. So that after Anna's departure, the marsh began to take on a new tone. The boys were gentlemen. Tom had a rare nature and had risen high. Fred was sensitive and fond of reading. He pondered Ruskin and then the agnostic writings. Like all the Brangwens, he was very much a thing to himself, though fond of people and indulgent to them, having an exaggerated respect for them. There was a rather uneasy friendship between him and one of the young Hardys at the Hall. The two households were different, yet the young men met on shy terms of equality. It was young Tom Brangwen, with his dark lashes and beautiful coloring, his soft, inscrutable nature, his strange repose, and his informed air, added to his position in London, who seemed to emphasize the superior foreign element in the marsh. When he appeared, perfectly dressed, as if soft and affable, and yet quite removed from everybody, he created an uneasiness in people. He was reserved in the minds of the Cossathay and Ilkeston acquaintances to a different, remote world. He and his mother had a kind of affinity. The affection between them was of a mute, distant character, but radical. His father was always uneasy and slightly deferential to his eldest son. Tom also formed the link that kept the marsh in real connection with the Skrebenskys, now quite important people in their own district. So a change in tone came over the marsh. Tom Brangwen the father, as he grew older, seemed to mature into a gentleman farmer. His figure lent itself, burly and handsome. His face remained fresh and his blue eyes as full of light. His thick hair and beard had turned gradually to a silky whiteness. It was his custom to laugh a great deal in his acquiescent, willful manner. Things had puzzled him very much, so he had taken the line of easy, good-humored acceptance. He was not responsible for the frame of things, yet he was afraid of the unknown in life. He was fairly well off. His wife was there with him, a different being from himself, yet somewhere vitally connected with him. Who was he to understand where and how? His two sons were gentlemen. They were men distinct from himself. They had separate beings of their own, yet they were connected with himself. It was all adventurous and puzzling, yet one remained vital within one's own existence, whatever the offshoots. So, handsome and puzzled, he laughed and stuck to himself as the only thing he could stick to. His youngness and the wonder remained almost the same in him. He became indolent. He developed a luxuriant ease. Fred did most of the farm work. The father saw to the more important transactions. He drove a good mare, and sometimes he rode his cob. He drank in the hotels and the inns with better-class farmers and proprietors. He had well-to-do acquaintances among men. But one class suited him no better than another. His wife, as ever, had no acquaintances. Her hair was threaded now with gray. Her face grew older in form without changing in expression. She seemed the same as when she had come to the marsh 25 years ago, save that her health was more fragile. She seemed always to haunt the marsh rather than to live there. She was never part of the life. Something she represented was alien there. She remained a stranger within the gates, in some ways fixed and impervious, in some ways curiously refining. She caused the separateness and individuality of all the marsh inmates, the friability of the household. When young Tom Brangwen was 23 years old, there was some breach between him and his chief which was never explained, and he went away to Italy, then to America. He came home for a while, then went to Germany. Always the same good-looking, carefully dressed, attractive young man, in perfect health, yet somehow outside of everything. In his dark eyes was a deep misery which he wore with the same ease and pleasantness as he wore his close-fitting clothes. To Ursula, he was a romantic, alluring figure. He had a grace of bringing beautiful presents, a box of expensive sweets, such as Kossuth had never seen, or he gave her a hairbrush and a long slim mirror of mother of pearl, all pale and glimmering and exquisite, or he sent her a little necklace of rough stones, amethyst and opal and brilliants and garnet. He spoke other languages easily and fluently. His nature was curiously gracious and insinuating. With all that, he was undefinably an outsider. He belonged to nowhere, to no society. Anna Brangwen had left her intimacy with her father undeveloped since the time of her marriage. At her marriage, it had been abandoned. He and she had drawn a reserve between them. Anna went more to her mother. Then suddenly the father died. It happened one springtime when Ursula was about 8 years old. He, Tom Brangwen, drove off on a Saturday morning to the market in Nottingham, saying he might not be back till late, as there was a special show and then a meeting he had to attend. His family understood that he would enjoy himself. The season had been rainy and dreary. In the evening it was pouring with rain. Fred Brangwen, unsettled, uneasy, did not go out, as was his wont. He smoked and read and fidgeted, hearing always the trickling of water outside. This wet, black night seemed to cut him off and make him unsettled, aware of himself, aware that he wanted something else, aware that he was scarcely living. There seemed to him to be no root to his life, no place for him to get satisfied in. He dreamed of going abroad, but his instinct knew that change of place would not solve his problem. He wanted change, deep, vital change of living, and he did not know how to get it. Tilly, an old woman now, came in saying that the laborers who had been suppering up said the yard and everywhere was just a slough of water. He heard in indifference, but he hated a desolate, raw wetness in the world. He would leave the marsh. His mother was in bed. At last he shut his book. His mind was blank. He walked upstairs intoxicated with depression and anger, and, intoxicated with depression and anger, locked himself into sleep. Tilly set slippers before the kitchen fire, and she also went to bed, leaving the door unlocked. Then the farm was in darkness, in the rain. At 11 o'clock, it was still raining. Tom Brangwen stood in the yard of the Angel, Nottingham, and buttoned his coat. "Oh, well," he said cheerfully, "it's rained on me before. Put her in, Jack, my lad, put her in. Thou art a rare old cock, Jacky boy. Why, a belly on thee as does credit to thy drink, if not to thy corn. Co, up lass, let's get off to old homestead. Oh, my heart, what a wetness in the night. There'll be no volcanoes after this. Hey, Jack, my beautiful young slender feller, which of us is Noah? It seems as though the waterworks is bursted. Ducks and aquatic fowl be king o' the castle at this rate, dove an olive branch and all. Stand up then, Gel. Stand up, we're not stoppin' here all night, even if you thought we was. I'm dashed if the jumping rain wouldn't make anybody think they was drunk. Hey, Jack, does rainwater wash the sense in, or does it wash it out?" And he laughed to himself at the joke. He was always ashamed when he had to drive after he had been drinking, always apologetic to the horse. His apologetic frame made him facetious. He was aware of his inability to walk quite straight. Nevertheless, his will kept stiff and attentive in all his fuddleness. He mounted and bowled off through the gates of the inn-yard. The mare went well. He sat fixed, the rain beating on his face. His heavy body rode motionless in a kind of sleep. One center of attention was kept fitfully burning. The rest was dark. He concentrated his last attention on the fact of driving along the road he knew so well. He knew it so well. He watched for it attentively, with an effort of will. He talked aloud to himself, sententious in his anxiety, as if he were perfectly sober, whilst the mare bowled along and the rain beat on him. He watched the rain before the gig lamps. the faint gleaming of the shadowy horse's body, the passing of the dark hedges. "It's not a fit night to turn a dog out," he said to himself aloud. "It's high time, as it did a bit of clearing up. I'll be damned if it isn't. It was a lot of use putting those 10 loads of cinders on road. They'll be washed to kingdom come if it doesn't alter. Well, it's our Fred's lookout if they are. He's topsawyer as far as those things go. I don't see why I should concern myself. They can wash to kingdom come and back again for what I care. I suppose they would be washed back again someday. That's how things are. Rain tumbles down just to mount up in clouds again. So they say. There's no more water on the earth than there was in the year naught. That's the story, my boy, if you understand it. There's no more today than there was 1,000 years ago, nor no less either. You can't wear water out. No, my boy. It'll give you the go-by. Try to wear it out, and it takes its hook into vapor. It has its fingers at its nose to you. It turns into cloud and falleth as rain on the just and unjust. I wonder if I'm the just or the unjust." He started awake as the trap lurched deep into a rut, and he wakened to the point in his journey. He had traveled some distance since he was last conscious, but at length he reached the gate and stumbled heavily down, reeling, gripping fast to the trap. He descended into several inches of water. "Be damned," he said angrily. "Be damned to the miserable slop." And he led the horse washing through the gate. He was quite drunk now, moving blindly in habit. Everywhere there was water underfoot. The raised causeway of the house and the farmstead was dry, however. But there was a curious roar in the night which seemed to be made in the darkness of his own intoxication. Reeling, blinded, almost without consciousness, he carried his parcels and the rug and cushions into the house, dropped them, and went out to put up the horse. Now he was at home. He was a sleepwalker, waiting only for the moment of activity to stop. Very deliberately and carefully, he led the horse down the slope to the cart shed. She shied and backed. "Why, what's amiss?" he hiccuped, plodding steadily on. And he was again in a wash of water. The horse splashed up water as he went. It was thickly dark, save for the gig lamps, and they lit on a rippling surface of water. "Well, that's a knockout," he said, as he came to the cart shed and was wading in 6 inches of water. But everything seemed to him amusing. He laughed to think of 6 inches of water being in the cart shed. He backed in the mare. She was restive. He laughed at the fun of untackling the mare with a lot of water washing round his feet. He laughed because it upset her. "What's amiss? What's amiss? A drop, oh, water won't hurt you." As soon as he had undone the traces, she walked quickly away. He hung up the shafts and took the gig lamp. As he came out of the familiar jumble of shafts and wheels in the shed, the water, in little waves, came washing strongly against his legs. He staggered and almost fell. "Well, what the deuce?" he said, staring round at the running water in the black, watery night. He went to meet the running flood, sinking deeper and deeper. His soul was full of great astonishment. He had to go and look where it came from, though the ground was going from under his feet. He went on, down towards the pond, shakily. He rather enjoyed it. He was knee-deep, and the water was pulling heavily. He stumbled, reeled sickeningly. Fear took hold of him. Gripping tightly to the lamp, he reeled and looked round. The water was carrying his feet away. He was dizzy. He did not know which way to turn. The water was whirling, whirling. The whole black night was swooping in rings. He swayed uncertainly at the center of all the attack, reeling in dismay. In his soul, he knew he would fall. As he staggered, something in the water struck his legs, and he fell. Instantly, he was in the turmoil of suffocation. He fought in a black horror of suffocation, fighting, wrestling, but always borne down, borne inevitably down. Still he wrestled and fought to get himself free, in the unutterable struggle of suffocation, but he always fell again deeper. Something struck his head. A great wonder of anguish went over him. Then the blackness covered him entirely. In the utter darkness, the unconscious, drowning body was rolled along, the waters pouring, washing, filling in the place. The cattle woke up and rose to their feet. The dog began to yelp. and the unconscious, drowning body was washed along in the black, swirling darkness, passively. Mrs. Brangwen woke up and listened. With preternaturally sharp senses, she heard the movement of all the darkness that swirled outside. For a moment she lay still. Then she went to the window. She heard the sharp rain and the deep running of water. She knew her husband was outside. "Fred," she called. "Fred." Away in the night was a hoarse, brutal roar of a mass of water rushing downwards. She went downstairs. She could not understand the multiplied running of water. Stepping down the step into the kitchen, she put her foot into water. The kitchen was flooded. Where did it come from? She could not understand. Water was running in out of the scullery. She paddled through barefoot to see. Water was bubbling fiercely under the outer door. She was afraid. Then something washed against her, something twined under her foot. It was the riding whip. On the table were the rug and the cushion and the parcel from the gig. He had come home. "Tom," she called, afraid of her own voice. She opened the door. Water ran in with a horrid sound. Everywhere was moving water, a sound of waters. "Tom," she cried, standing in her nightdress with the candle, calling into the darkness and the flood out of the doorway. "Tom, Tom." And she listened. Fred appeared behind her, in trousers and shirt. "Where is he?" he asked. He looked at the flood, then at his mother. She seemed small and uncanny, elvish, in her nightdress. "Go upstairs," he said. "He'll be in th stable." "To-om, to-om," cried the elderly woman with a long, unnatural, penetrating call that chilled her son to the marrow. He quickly pulled on his boots and his coat. "Go upstairs, mother," he said. "I'll go and see where he is." "To-om, to-o-om," rang out the shrill, unearthly cry of the small woman. There was only the noise of water and the mooing of uneasy cattle and the long yelping of the dog, clamoring in the darkness. Fred Brangwen splashed out into the flood with a lantern. His mother stood on a chair in the doorway, watching him go. It was all water, water, running, flashing under the lantern. "Tom, Tom." "To-o-om," came her long, unnatural cry, ringing over the night. It made her son feel cold in his soul. And the unconscious, drowning body of the father rolled on below the house, driven by the black water towards the high road. Tilly appeared, a skirt over her nightdress. She saw her mistress clinging on the top of a chair in the open doorway, a candle burning on the table. "God's sake," cried the old serving woman. The cuts burst. That embankment's broke down. What diver are we going to do? Mrs. Brangwen watched her son and the lantern go along the upper causeway to the stable. Then she saw the dark figure of a horse. Then her son hung the lamp in the stable, and the light shone out faintly on him as he untackled the mare. The mother saw the soft blazed face of the horse thrust forward into the stable door. The stables were still above the flood, but the water flowed strongly into the house. "It's getting higher," said Tilly. "Hasn't master come in?" Mrs. Brangwen did not hear. "Isn't he the heir?" she called, in her far-reaching, terrifying voice. "No," came the short answer out of the night. "Go and luoke for him." His mother's voice nearly drove the youth mad. He put the halter on the horse and shut the stable door. He came splashing back through the water, the lantern swinging. The unconscious, drowning body was pushed past the house in the deepest current. Fred Brangwen came to his mother. "I'll go to cart shed," he said. To-o-om, rang out the strong, inhuman cry. Fred Brangwen's blood froze. His heart was very angry. He gripped his veins in a frenzy. Why was she yelling like this? He could not bear the sight of her, perched on a chair in her white nightdress in the doorway, elvish and horrible. "He's taken the mare out of the trap, so he's all right," he said, growling, pretending to be normal. But as he descended to the cart shed, he sank into a foot of water. He heard the rushing in the distance. He knew the canal had broken down. The water was running deeper. The trap was there all right, but no signs of his father. The young man waded down to the pond. The water rose above his knees. It swirled and forced him. He drew back. "Is he the heir?" came the maddening cry of the mother. "No," was the sharp answer. To OM, came the piercing, free, unearthly call. It seemed high and supernatural, almost pure. Fred Brangwen hated it. It nearly drove him mad. So awfully it sang out, almost like a song. The water was flowing fuller into the house. "You'd better go up to Beebe's and bring him and Arthur down, and tell Mrs. Beebe to fetch Wilkinson," said Fred to Tilly. He forced his mother to go upstairs. "I know your father is drowned," she said, in a curious dismay. The flood rose through the night, till it washed the kettle off the hob in the kitchen. Mrs. Brangwen sat alone at a window upstairs. She called no more. The men were busy with the pigs and the cattle. They were coming with the boat for her. Towards morning the rain ceased. The stars came out over the noise and the terrifying clucking and trickling of the water. Then there was a pallor in the east. The light began to come. In the ruddy light of the dawn, she saw the waters spreading out, moving sluggishly, the buildings rising out of a waste of water. Birds began to sing, drowsily, and as if slightly hoarse with the dawn. It grew brighter. Up the second field was the great, raw gap in the canal embankment. Mrs. Brangwen went from window to window, watching the flood. Somebody had brought a little boat. The light grew stronger. The red gleam was gone off the floodwaters. Day took place. Mrs. Brangwen went from the front of the house to the back, looking out, intent and unrelaxing, on the pallid morning of spring. She saw a glimpse of her husband's buff coat in the floods as the water rolled the body against the garden hedge. She called to the men in the boat. She was glad he was found. They dragged him out of the hedge. They could not lift him into the boat. Fred Brangwen jumped into the water, up to his waist, and half carried the body of his father through the flood to the road. Hay and twigs and dirt were in the beard and hair. The youth pushed through the water, crying loudly without tears, like a stricken animal. The mother at the window cried, making no trouble. The doctor came, but the body was dead. They carried it up to Kossethe, to Anna's house. When Anna Brangwen heard the news, she pressed back her head and rolled her eyes, as if something were reaching forward to bite at her throat. She pressed back her head. Her mind was driven back to sleep. Since she had married and become a mother, the girl she had been was forgotten. Now, the shock threatened to break in upon her and sweep away all her intervening life, make her as a girl of 18 again, loving her father. So she pressed back, away from the shock. She clung to her present life. It was when they brought him to her house dead and in his wet clothes, his wet, sodden clothes, fully dressed as he came from market, yet all sodden and inert, that the shock really broke into her, and she was terrified. A big, soaked, inert heap he was, who had been to her the image of power and strong life. Almost in horror, she began to take the wet things from him, to pull off him the incongruous market clothes of a well-to-do farmer. The children were sent away to the vicarage. The dead body lay on the parlor floor. Anna quickly began to undress him, laid his fob and seals in a wet heap on the table. Her husband and the woman helped her. They cleared and washed the body and laid it on the bed. There it looked still and grand. He was perfectly calm in death, and now he was laid in line, inviolable, unapproachable. To Anna, he was the majesty of the inaccessible male, the majesty of death. It made her still and awe-stricken, almost glad. Lydia Brangwen, the mother, also came and saw the impressive, inviolable body of the dead man. She went pale, seeing death. He was beyond change or knowledge, absolute, laid in line with the infinite. What had she to do with him? He was a majestic abstraction, made visible now for a moment, inviolate, absolute. And who could lay claim to him, who could speak of him, of the him who was revealed in the stripped moment of transit from life into death? Neither the living nor the dead could claim him. He was both the one and the other, inviolable, inaccessibly himself. "I shared life with you. I belong in my own way to eternity," said Lydia Brangwen, her heart cold, knowing her own singleness. "I did not know you in life. You are beyond me, supreme now in death," said Anna Brangwen, awe-stricken, almost glad. It was the sons who could not bear it. Fred Brangwen went about with a set, blanched face and shut hands, his heart full of hatred and rage for what had been done to his father, bleeding also with desire to have his father again, to see him, to hear him again. He could not bear it. Tom Brangwen only arrived on the day of the funeral. He was quiet and controlled as ever. He kissed his mother, who was still dark-faced, inscrutable. He shook hands with his brother without looking at him. He saw the great coffin with its black handles. He even read the nameplate, Tom Brangwen of the Marsh Farm. Born, died. The good-looking, still face of the young man crinkled up for a moment in a terrible grimace, then resumed its stillness. The coffin was carried round to the church. The funeral bell tanged at intervals. The mourners carried their wreaths of white flowers. The mother, the Polish woman, went with dark, abstract face on her son's arm. He was good-looking as ever, his face perfectly motionless and somehow pleasant. Fred walked with Anna, she strange and winsome, he with a face like wood, stiff, unyielding. Only afterwards Ursula, flitting between the currant bushes down the garden, saw her uncle. Terrified, Ursula slipped away. And when her Uncle Tom was in the house again, grave and very quiet, so that he seemed almost to affect gravity, to pretend grief, she watched his still, handsome face, imagining it again in its distortion. But she saw the nose was rather thick, rather Russian, under its transparent skin. She remembered the teeth under the carefully cut mustache were small and sharp and spaced. She could see him, in all his elegant demeanor, bestial, almost corrupt. And she was frightened. She never forgot to look for the bestial, frightening side of him after this. He said goodbye to his mother and went away at once. Ursula almost shrank from his kiss now. She wanted it nevertheless, and the little revulsion as well. At the funeral, and after the funeral, while Brangwen was madly in love with his wife. The death had shaken him, but death and all seemed to gather in him into a mad, overwhelming passion for his wife. She seemed so strange and winsome. He was almost beside himself with desire for her. And she took him. She seemed ready for him. She wanted him. The grandmother stayed a while at the Yew cottage till the marsh was restored. Then she returned to her own rooms, quiet, and it seemed, wanting nothing. Fred threw himself into the work of restoring the farm. That his father was killed there seemed to make it only the more intimate, and the more inevitably his own place. There was a saying that the Brangwens always died a violent death. To them all, except perhaps Tom, it seemed almost natural. Yet Fred went about obstinate, his heart fixed. He could never forgive the unknown this murder of his father. After the death of the father, the marsh was very quiet. Mrs. Brangwen was unsettled. She could not sit all the evening peacefully, as she could before, and during the day she was always rising to her feet and hesitating, as if she must go somewhere, and were not quite sure whither. She was seen loitering about the garden, in her little woolen jacket. She was often driven out in the gig, sitting beside her son, and watching the countryside or the streets of the town, with a childish, candid, uncanny face, as if it all were strange to her. The children, Ursula and Gudrun and Teresa, went by the garden gate on their way to school. The grandmother would have them call, and each time they passed, she would have them come to the marsh for dinner. She wanted children about her. Of her sons, she was almost afraid. She could see the somber passion and desire and dissatisfaction in them, and she wanted not to see it any more. Even Fred, with his blue eyes and his heavy jaw, troubled her. There was no peace. He wanted something. He wanted love, passion, and he could not find them. But why must he trouble her? Why must he come to her with his seething and suffering and dissatisfactions? She was too old. Tom was more restrained, reserved. He kept his body very still, but he troubled her even more. She could not but see the black depths of disintegration in his eyes, the sudden glance upon her, as if she could save him, as if he would reveal himself. And how could age save youth? Youth must go to youth. Always the storm. Could she not lie in peace, these years, in the quiet, apart from life? No. Always the swell must heave upon her and break against the barriers. Always she must be embroiled in the seethe and rage and passion, endless, endless, going on forever. And she wanted to draw away. She wanted at last her own innocence and peace. She did not want her sons to force upon her any more the old brutal story of desire and offerings and deep, deep hidden rage of unsatisfied men against women. She wanted to be beyond it all, to know the peace and innocence of age. She had never been a woman to work much, so that now she would stand often at the garden gate, watching the scant world go by. And the sight of children pleased her, made her happy. She had usually an apple or a few sweets in her pocket. She liked children to smile at her. She never went to her husband's grave. She spoke of him simply, as if he were alive. Sometimes the tears would run down her face in helpless sadness. Then she recovered and was herself again, happy. On wet days, she stayed in bed. Her bedroom was her city of refuge, where she could lie down and muse and muse. Sometimes Fred would read to her, but that did not mean much. She had so many dreams to dream over, such an unsifted store. She wanted time. Her chief friend at this period was Ursula. The little girl and the musing, fragile woman of 60 seemed to understand the same language. At Kossuth, all was activity and passion. Everything moved upon poles of passion. Then there were 4 children younger than Ursula, a throng of babies, all the time many lives beating against each other. So that for the eldest child, the peace of the grandmother's bedroom was exquisite. Here Ursula came as to a hushed, paradisal land. Here her own existence became simple and exquisite to her as if she were a flower. Always on Saturdays she came down to the marsh, and always clutching a little offering, either a little mat made of strips of colored, woven paper, or a tiny basket made in the kindergarten lesson, or a little crayon drawing of a bird. When she appeared in the doorway, Tilly, ancient but still in authority, would crane her skinny neck to see who it was. "Oh, it's you, is it?" she said. "I thought we should be seeing you. My word, that's a bobby dazzlin' posy you've brought." It was curious how Tilly preserved the spirit of Tom Brangwen, who is dead, in the marsh. Ursula always connected her with her grandfather. This day the child had brought a tight little nosegay of pinks, white ones, with a rim of pink ones. She was very proud of it, and very shy because of her pride. "Your grandmother's in her bed. Wipe your shoes well if you're going up, and don't go burstin' in on her like a skyrocket. My word, but that's a fine posy. Did you do it all by yourself, and all?" Tilly stealthily ushered her into the bedroom. The child entered with a strange, dragging hesitation characteristic of her when she was moved. Her grandmother was sitting up in bed, wearing a little gray woolen jacket. The child hesitated in silence near the bed, clutching the nosegay in front of her. Her childish eyes were shining. The grandmother's gray eyes shone with a similar light. "How pretty," she said. "How pretty you have made them. What a darling little bunch." Ursula, glowing, thrust them into her grandmother's hand, saying, "I made them you." "That is how the peasants tied them at home," said the grandmother, pushing the pinks with her fingers and smelling them. "Just such tight little bunches. And they make wreaths for their hair. They weave the stalks. Then they go round with wreaths in their hair and wearing their best aprons." Ursula immediately imagined herself in this storyland. "Did you used to have a wreath in your hair, grandmother?" "When I was a little girl, I had golden hair, something like Katie's. Then I used to have a wreath of little blue flowers, oh, so blue, that come when the snow is gone. Andre, the coachman, used to bring me the very first." They talked, and then Tilly brought the tea tray, set for 2. Ursula had a special green and gold cup kept for herself at the marsh. There was thin bread and butter and cress for tea. It was all special and wonderful. She ate very daintily, with little fastidious bites. "Why do you have 2 wedding rings, grandmother? Must you?" asked the child, noticing her grandmother's ivory-colored hand with blue veins above the tray. "If I had 2 husbands, child." Ursula pondered a moment. "Then you must wear both rings together?" "Yes." "Which was my grandfather's ring?" The woman hesitated. "This grandfather whom you knew? This was his ring, the red one. The yellow one was your other grandfather's whom you never knew." Ursula looked interestedly at the 2 rings on the proffered finger. "Where did he bite you?" she asked. "This one? In Warsaw, I think." "You didn't know my own grandfather then?" "Not this grandfather." Ursula pondered this fascinating intelligence. Did he have white whiskers as well? "No, his beard was dark. You have his brows, I think." Ursula ceased and became self-conscious. She at once identified herself with her Polish grandfather. "And did he have brown eyes?" "Yes, dark eyes. He was a clever man, as quick as a lion. He was never still." Lydia still resented Lenski. When she thought of him, she was always younger than he, she was always 20 or 25, and under his domination. He incorporated her in his ideas as if she were not a person herself, as if she were just his aide-de-camp, or part of his baggage, or one among his surgical appliances. She still resented it. And he was always only 30. He had died when he was 34. She did not feel sorry for him. He was older than she. Yet she still ached in the thought of those days. "Did you like my first grandfather best?" asked Ursula. "I liked them both," said the grandmother. And, thinking, she became again Lenski's girl bride. He was of good family, of better family even than her own, for she was half German. She was a young girl in a house of insecure fortune. And he, an intellectual, a clever surgeon and physician, had loved her. How she had looked up to him. She remembered her first transports when he talked to her, the important young man with the severe black beard. He had seemed so wonderful, such an authority. After her own lax household, his gravity and confident, hard authority seemed almost godlike to her, for she had never known it in her life. All her surroundings had been loose, lax, disordered, a welter. "Miss Lydia, will you marry me?" he had said to her in German, in his grave, yet tremulous voice. She had been afraid of his dark eyes upon her. They did not see her. They were fixed upon her, and he was hard, confident. She thrilled with the excitement of it and accepted. During the courtship, his kisses were a wonder to her. She always thought about them and wondered over them. She never wanted to kiss him back. In her idea, the man kissed, and the woman examined in her soul the kisses she had received. She had never quite recovered from her prostration of the first days or nights of marriage. He had taken her to Vienna, and she was utterly alone with him, utterly alone in another world, everything foreign, even he foreign to her. Then came the real marriage, passion came to her, and she became his slave. He was her lord, her lord. She was the girl bride, the slave. She kissed his feet. She had thought it an honor to touch his body, to unfasten his boots. For 2 years, she had gone on as a slave, crouching at his feet, embracing his knees. Children had come, he had followed his ideas. She was there for him, just to keep him in condition. She was to him one of the baser or material conditions necessary for his welfare in prosecuting his ideas of nationalism, of liberty, of science. But gradually, at 23, 24, she began to realize that she too might consider these ideas. By his acceptance of her self-subordination, he exhausted the feeling in her. There were those of his associates who would discuss the ideas with her, though he did not wish to do so himself. She had ventured into the minds of other men. His, then, was not the only male mind. She did not exist, then, just as his attribute. She began to perceive the attention of other men. An excitement came over her. She remembered now the men who had paid her court when she was married in Warsaw. Then the rebellion broke out, and she was inspired too. She would go as a nurse at her husband's side. He worked like a lion. He wore his life out, and she followed him helplessly. But she disbelieved in him. He was so separate, he ignored so much. He counted too much on himself. His work, his ideas, did nothing else matter? Then the children were dead, and for her, everything became remote. He became remote. She saw him. She saw him go white when he heard the news, then frown, as if he thought, "Why have they died now, when I have no time to grieve?" "He has no time to grieve," she had said, in her remote, awful soul.
He has no time.
It is so important what he does. He is then so self-important. this half-frenzied man. Nothing matters but this work of rebellion. He has not time to grieve, nor to think of his children. He had not time even to beget them, really. She had let him go on alone. But in the chaos, she had worked by his side again. And out of the chaos, she had fled with him to London. He was a broken, cold man. He had no affection for her, nor for anyone. He had failed in his work, so everything had failed. He stiffened and died. She could not subscribe. He had failed. Everything had failed. Yet behind the failure was the unyielding passion of life. The individual effort might fail, but not the human joy. She belonged to the human joy. He died and went his way, but not before there was another child. And this little Ursula was his grandchild. She was glad of it, for she still honored him, though he had been mistaken. She, Lydia Brangwen, was sorry for him now. He was dead. He had scarcely lived. He had never known her. He had lain with her, but he had never known her. He had never received what she could give him. He had gone away from her empty, so he had never lived. So he had died and passed away. Yet there had been strength and power in him. She could scarcely forgive him that he had never lived. If it were not for Anna, and for this little Ursula, who had his brows, there would be no more left of him than of a broken vessel thrown away and just remembered. Tom Brangwen had served her. He had come to her and taken from her. He had died and gone his way into death. But he had made himself immortal in his knowledge with her. So she had her place here, in life and in immortality. For he had taken his knowledge of her into death, so that she had her place in death. In my Father's house are many mansions. She loved both her husbands. To one she had been a naked little girl bride, running to serve him. The other she loved out of fulfillment, because he was good and had given her being, because he had served her honorably and become her man, one with her. She was established in this stretch of life. She had come to herself. During her first marriage, she had not existed, except through him. He was the substance, and she the shadow running at his feet. She was very glad she had come to her own self. She was grateful to Brangwen. She reached out to him in gratitude, into death. In her heart, she felt a vague tenderness and pity for her first husband, who had been her lord. He was so wrong when he died. She could not bear it, that he had never lived, never really become himself. And he had been her lord. Strange, it all had been. Why had he been her lord? He seemed now so far off, so without bearing on her. Which did you, grandmother?
What?
Like best? I like them both. I married the first when I was quite a girl. Then I loved your grandfather when I was a woman. There is a difference. They were silent for a time. Did you cry when my first grandfather died? The child asked. Lydia Brangwen rocked herself on the bed, thinking aloud. When we came to England, he hardly ever spoke. He was too much concerned to take any notice of anybody. He grew thinner and thinner, till his cheeks were hollow and his mouth stuck out. He wasn't handsome anymore. I knew he couldn't bear being beaten. I thought everything was lost in the world. Only I had your mother a baby, it was no use my dying. He looked at me with his black eyes, almost as if he hated me, when he was ill, and said, "It only wanted this. It only wanted that I should leave you and a young child to starve in this London." I told him we should not starve, but I was young and foolish and frightened, which he knew. He was bitter, and he never gave way. He lay beating his brains to see what he could do.
"I don't know what you will do," he said.
"I am no good. I am a failure from beginning to end. I cannot even provide for my wife and child." But you see, it was not for him to provide for us. My life went on, though his stopped, and I married your grandfather. I ought to have known. I ought to have been able to say to him, "Don't be so bitter. Don't die, because this has failed. You are not the beginning and the end." But I was too young. He had never let me become myself. I thought he was truly the beginning and the end. So I let him take all upon himself. Yet all did not depend on him. Life must go on, and I must marry your grandfather, and have your Uncle Tom and your Uncle Fred. We cannot take so much upon ourselves." The child's heart beat fast as she listened to these things. She could not understand, but she seemed to feel far-off things. It gave her a deep, joyous thrill to know she hailed from far off, from Poland, and that dark-bearded, impressive man. Strange her antecedents were, and she felt fate on either side of her terrible. Almost every day, Ursula saw her grandmother, and every time they talked together, till the grandmother's sayings and stories, told in the complete hush of the marsh bedroom, accumulated with mystic significance and became a sort of Bible to the child. And Ursula asked her deepest childish questions of her grandmother. "Will somebody love me, grandmother?" "Many people love you, child. We all love you. But when I am grown up, will somebody love me?" "Yes, some man will love you, child, because it's your nature. And I hope it will be somebody who will love you for what you are and not for what he wants of you. But we have a right to what we want." Ursula was frightened hearing these things. Her heart sank. She felt she had no ground under her feet. She clung to her grandmother. Here was peace and security. Here, from her grandmother's peaceful room, the door opened onto the greater space, the past, which was so big that all it contained seemed tiny, loves and births and deaths, tiny units and features within a vast horizon. That was a great relief, to know the tiny importance of the individual within the great past. X. The widening circle. It was very burdensome to Ursula that she was the eldest of the family. By the time she was 11, she had to take to school Gudrun and Teresa and Catherine. The boy, William, always called Billy so that he should not be confused with his father, was a lovable, rather delicate child of 3, so he stayed at home as yet. There was another baby girl called Cassandra. The children went for a time to the little church school just near the marsh. It was the only place within reach, and being so small, Mrs. Brangwen felt safe in sending her children there, though the village boys did nickname Ursula Ertler, and Gudrun Good Runner, and Teresa Teapot. Gudrun and Ursula were co-medess. The second child, with her long, sleepy body and her endless chain of fancies, would have nothing to do with realities. She was not for them. She was for her own fancies. Ursula was the one for realities. So Gudrun left all such to her elder sister and trusted in her implicitly, indifferently. Ursula had a great tenderness for her calmate sister. It was no good trying to make Gudrun responsible. She floated along like a fish in the sea, perfect within the medium of her own difference and being. Other existence did not trouble her. Only she believed in Ursula and trusted to Ursula. The eldest child was very much fretted by her responsibility for the other young ones. Especially Teresa, a sturdy, bold-eyed thing, had a faculty for warfare. Our Ursula, Billy Pillins has lugged my hair. What did you say to him? I said nothing. Then the Brangwen girls were in for a feud with the Pillinses, or Phillipses. You won't pull my hair again, Billy Pillins, said Teresa, walking with her sisters and looking superbly at the freckled, red-haired boy. Why shan't I? Retorted Billy Pillins. You won't because you dursn't, said the tiresome Teresa. You come here, then, Teapot, and see if I durstna. Up marched Teapot, and immediately Billy Pillins lugged her black, snaky locks. In a rage, she flew at him. Immediately in rushed Ursula and Gudrun, and little Katie. In clashed the other Phillipses, Clem and Walter, and Eddie Anthony. Then there was a fray. The Brangwen girls were well-grown and stronger than many boys. But for pinafores and long hair, they would have carried easy victories. They went home, however, with hair lugged and pinafores torn. It was a joy to the Phillips boys to rip the pinafores of the Brangwen girls. Then there was an outcry. Mrs. Brangwen would not have it. No, she would not. All her innate dignity and standoffishness rose up. Then there was the vicar lecturing the school. It was a sad thing that the boys of Kossuth could not behave more like gentlemen to the girls of Kossuth. Indeed, what kind of boy was it that should set upon a girl and kick her and beat her and tear her pinafore? That boy deserved severe castigation and the name of coward, for no boy who is not a coward, etc., etc. Meanwhile, much hangdog fury in the Pillins' hearts. much virtue in the Brangwen girls, particularly in Teresa's. And the feud continued, with periods of extraordinary amity, when Ursula was Clem Phillips's sweetheart, and Gudrun was Walter's, and Teresa was Billy's, and even the tiny Katie had to be Eddie Aunt New York's sweetheart. There was the closest union. At every possible moment, the little gang of Brangwens and Phillipses flew together. Yet neither Ursula nor Gudrun would have any real intimacy with the Phillips boys. It was a sort of fiction to them, this alliance and this dubbing of sweethearts. Again, Mrs. Brangwen rose up. "Ursula, I will not have you raking the roads with lads, so I tell you. Now stop it, and the rest will stop it." How Ursula hated always to represent the little Brangwen club. She could never be herself, no. She was always Ursula Gudrun Teresa Catherine, and later even Billy was added onto her. Moreover, she did not want the Phillipses either. She was out of taste with them. However, the Brangwen Pillins coalition readily broke down, owing to the unfair superiority of the Brangwens. The Brangwens were rich. They had free access to the marsh farm. The school teachers were almost respectful to the girls. The vicar spoke to them on equal terms. The Brangwen girls presumed. They tossed their heads. "You're not everybody, Ertler Brangwen ugly mug," said Clem Phillips, his face going very red. "I'm better than you for all that," retorted Ertler. "You think you are, why a face like that, ugly mug, Ertler Brangwen," he began to jeer, trying to set all the others and cry against her. Then there was hostility again. How she hated their jeering. She became cold against the Phillipses. Ursula was very proud in her family. The Brangwen girls had all a curious blind dignity, even a kind of nobility in their bearing. By some result of breed and upbringing, they seemed to rush along their own lives without caring that they existed to other people. Never from the start did it occur to Ursula that other people might hold a low opinion of her. She thought that whosoever knew her, knew she was enough and accepted her as such. She thought it was a world of people like herself. She suffered bitterly if she were forced to have a low opinion of any person, and she never forgave that person. This was maddening to many little people. All their lives, the Brangwens were meeting folk who tried to pull them down to make them seem little. Curiously, the mother was aware of what would happen and was always ready to give her children the advantage of the move. When Ursula was 12, and the common school and the companionship of the village children, niggardly and begrudging, was beginning to affect her, Anna sent her with Gudrun to the grammar school in Nottingham. This was a great release for Ursula. She had a passionate craving to escape from the belittling circumstances of life, the little jealousies, the little differences, the little meannesses. It was a torture to her that the Phillipses were poorer and meaner than herself, that they used mean little reservations, took petty little advantages. She wanted to be with her equals, but not by diminishing herself. She did want Clem Phillips to be her equal, but by some puzzling, painful fate or other, when he was really there with her, he produced in her a tight feeling in the head. She wanted to beat her forehead, to escape. Then she found that the way to escape was easy. One departed from the whole circumstance. One went away to the grammar school and left the little school, the meager teachers, the Phillipses whom she had tried to love, but who had made her fail, and whom she could not forgive. She had an instinctive fear of petty people, as a deer is afraid of dogs. Because she was blind, she could not calculate nor estimate people. She must think that everybody was just like herself. She measured by the standard of her own people, her father and mother, her grandmother, her uncles. Her beloved father, so utterly simple in his demeanor, yet with his strong, dark soul fixed like a root in unexpressed depths that fascinated and terrified her. Her mother, so strangely free of all money and convention and fear, entirely indifferent to the world, standing by herself, without connection. Her grandmother, who had come from so far and was centered in so wide an horizon. People must come up to these standards before they could be Ursula's people. So even as a girl of 12, she was glad to burst the narrow boundary of Kossuth, where only limited people lived. Outside was all vastness and a throng of real, proud people whom she would love. Going to school by train, she must leave home at 7:45 in the morning, and she did not arrive again till 5:30 that evening. Of this she was glad, for the house was small and overfull. It was a storm of movement, whence there had been no escape. She hated so much being in charge. The house was a storm of movement. The children were healthy and turbulent. The mother only wanted their animal well-being. To Ursula, as she grew a little older, it became a nightmare. When she saw, later, a Rubens picture with storms of naked babies and found this was called fecundity, she shuddered, and the world became abhorrent to her. She knew as a child what it was to live amid storms of babies, in the heat and swelter of fecundity. And as a child, she was against her mother, passionately against her mother. She craved for some spirituality and stateliness. In bad weather, home was a bedlam. Children dashed in and out of the rain, to the puddles under the dismal yew trees, across the wet flagstones of the kitchen, whilst the cleaning woman grumbled and scolded. Children were swarming on the sofa. Children were kicking the piano in the parlor to make it sound like a beehive. Children were rolling on the hearthrug, legs in air, pulling a book in two between them. Children, fiendish, ubiquitous, were stealing upstairs to find out where our Ursula was, whispering at bedroom doors, hanging on the latch, calling mysteriously, Ursula, Ursula, to the girl who had locked herself in to read. And it was hopeless. The locked door excited their sense of mystery. She had to open to dispel the lure. These children hung on to her with round-eyed, excited questions. The mother flourished amid all this. Better have them noisy than ill, she said. But the growing girls, in turn, suffered bitterly. Ursula was just coming to the stage when Andersen and Grimm were being left behind for the idols of the king and romantic love stories. Elaine the fair, Elaine the lovable, Elaine the lily made of Astolat, high in her chamber in a tower to the east guarded the sacred shield of Lancelot. How she loved it! How she leaned in her bedroom window with her black, rough hair on her shoulders and her warm face all wrapped, and gazed across at the churchyard and the little church, which was a turreted castle, whence Lancelot would ride just now, would wave to her as he rode by, his scarlet cloak passing behind the dark yew trees and between the open space, whilst she would remain the lonely maid high up and isolated in the tower, polishing the terrible shield, weaving it a covering with a true device, and waiting, always remote and high. At which point there would be a faint scuffle on the stairs, a light-pitched whispering outside the door, and a creaking of the latch. Then Billy, excited, whispering, "It's locked, it's locked." Then the knocking, kicking at the door with childish knees, and the urgent, childish, "Ursula, our Ursula? Ursula? Our Ursula." No reply. "Ursula, our Ursula." The name was shouted now. Still no answer. "Mother, she won't answer." Came the yell. "She's dead." "Go away, I'm not dead. What do you want?" Came the angry voice of the girl. "Open the door, our Ursula." Came the complaining cry. It was all over. She must open the door. She heard the screech of the bucket downstairs dragged across the flagstones as the woman washed the kitchen floor. And the children were prowling in the bedroom, asking, "What were you doing? What had you locked the door for?" Then she discovered the key of the parish room and betook herself there and sat on some sacks with her books. There began another dream. She was the only daughter of the old lord. She was gifted with magic. Day followed day of rapt silence, whilst she wandered ghost-like in the hushed, ancient mansion, or flitted along the sleeping terraces. Here a grave grief attacked her, that her hair was dark. She must have fair hair and a white skin. She was rather bitter about her black mane. Never mind, she would dye it when she grew up, or bleach it in the sun, till it was bleached fair. Meanwhile, she wore a fair white coif of pure Venetian lace. She flitted silently along the terraces, where jeweled lizards basked upon the stone, and did not move when her shadow fell upon them. In the utter stillness, she heard the tinkle of the fountain, and smelled the roses whose blossoms hung rich and motionless. So she drifted on the wistful feet of beauty, past the water and the swans, to the noble park, where underneath a great oak, a doe all dappled lay with her 4 fine feet together, her fawn nestling sun-colored beside her. Oh, and this doe was her familiar. It would talk to her. Because she was a magician, it would tell her stories as if the sunshine spoke. Then one day, she left the door of the parish room unlocked, careless and unheeding as she always was. The children found their way in. Katie cut her finger and howled. Billy hacked notches in the fine chisels and did much damage. There was a great commotion. The crossness of the mother was soon finished. Ursula locked up the room again and considered all was over. Then her father came in with the notched tools, his forehead knotted. "Who the deuce opened the door?" he cried in anger. "It was Ursula who opened the door," said her mother. He had a duster in his hand. He turned and flapped the cloth hard across the girl's face. The cloth stung. For a moment the girl was as if stunned. Then she remained motionless, her face closed and stubborn. But her heart was blazing. In spite of herself, the tears surged higher. In spite of her, they surged higher. In spite of her, her face broke. She made a curious gulping grimace, and the tears were falling. So she went away, desolate. But her blazing heart was fierce and unyielding. He watched her go, and a pleasurable pain filled him, a sense of triumph and easy power, followed immediately by acute pity. "I'm sure that was unnecessary, to hit the girl across the face," said the mother coldly. "A flip with the duster won't hurt her," he said. "Nor will it do her any good." For days, for weeks, Ursula's heart burned from this rebuff. She felt so cruelly vulnerable. Did he not know how vulnerable she was, how exposed and wincing? He, of all people, knew. And he wanted to do this to her. He wanted to hurt her right through her closest sensitiveness. He wanted to treat her with shame, to maim her with insult. Her heart burnt in isolation, like a watchfire lighted. She did not forget. She did not forget. She never forgot. When she returned to her love for her father, the seed of mistrust and defiance burned unquenched, though covered up far from sight. She no longer belonged to him unquestioned. Slowly, slowly, the fire of mistrust and defiance burned in her, burned away her connection with him. She ran a good deal alone, having a passion for all moving, active things. She loved the little brooks. Wherever she found a little running water, she was happy. It seemed to make her run and sing in spirit along with it. She could sit for hours by a brook or stream, on the roots of the alders, and watch the water hasten dancing over the stones, or among the twigs of a fallen branch. Sometimes, little fish vanished before they had become real, like hallucinations. Sometimes wagtails ran by the water's brink. Sometimes other little birds came to drink. She saw a kingfisher darting blue, and then she was very happy. The kingfisher was the key to the magic world. He was witness of the border of enchantment. But she must move out of the intricately woven illusion of her life, the illusion of a father whose life was an odyssey in an outer world, the illusion of her grandmother, of realities so shadowy and far off that they became as mystic symbols. Peasant girls with wreaths of blue flowers in their hair, the sledges and the depths of winter, the dark-bearded young grandfather, marriage and war and death. Then the multitude of illusions concerning herself, how she was truly a princess of Poland, how in England she was under spell. She was not really this Ursula Brangwen. Then the mirage of her reading, out of the multicolored illusion of this her life, she must move on, to the grammar school in Nottingham. She was shy, and she suffered. For one thing, she bit her nails, and had a cruel consciousness in her fingertips, a shame, an exposure. Out of all proportion, this shame haunted her. She spent hours of torture, conjuring how she might keep her gloves on, if she might say her hands were scalded, if she might seem to forget to take off her gloves. For she was going to inherit her own estate when she went to the high school. There, each girl was a lady. There, she was going to walk among free souls, her comites and her equals, and all petty things would be put away. Ah, if only she did not bite her nails. If only she had not this blemish. She wanted so much to be perfect, without spot or blemish, living the high, noble life. It was a grief to her that her father made such a poor introduction. He was brief as ever, like a boy saying his errand, and his clothes looked ill-fitting and casual, whereas Ursula would have liked robes and a ceremonial of introduction to this, her new estate. She made a new illusion of school. Miss Gray, the headmistress, had a certain silvery, schoolmistressy beauty of character. The school itself had been a gentleman's house. Dark, somber lawns separated it from the dark, select avenue. But its rooms were large and of good appearance, and from the back, one looked over lawns and shrubbery, over the trees and the grassy slope of the arboretum, to the town which heaped the hollow with its roofs and cupolas